And you're live.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Varsak. I'm the exhibitions director and curator at the Duluth Art Institute. And tonight we are meeting with artist Alyssa Swanson. Alyssa earned her Bachelor of Art degree from the University of the College of
Yeah.
St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. She focused on painting and drawing and continued that two-dimensional focus during her master's degree from Bowling Green State University. Alyssa's work, exhibited as material, is on view in our corridor gallery through January 2021. In this exhibition, Alyssa weaves the influences of her ancestors, family, and mentors into monochromatic, abstract objects. Beginning with inexpensive acrylic yarns, bulk fabrics, and discarded scraps, she embraces the modest materials used by her great-grandmother, great-aunt, grandmother, and mother. Alyssa's going to talk to us about her work tonight, and we'll follow up with some questions. If you have anything you'd like to ask Alyssa, please do so in the chat. Hi, Alyssa.
Hi, thank you for having me. This feels kind of weird. I should probably preface this ahead of time that usually I'm the person behind the screen, and usually nobody can see or hear me, so this is kind of fun. But I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited to have you. And I should also mention that Alyssa's work was chosen by our 2020 community panel. And we started installing her work just months following her joining us at the Duluth Art Institute as a staff member. And she's our community engagement and development manager. So we're excited to have you in two capacities.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. So I'm actually going to, because I'm running all of this, I have to run all of the computer programs. So I'm sorry, everybody, if something happens because I'm nervous and talking about myself. But for right now, I'm going to take Amy off the screen and I'm going to tell you about my work, okay? So Amy, you can mute yourself too.
Great.
And okay, so this is me. I'm going to take this off really quick. So first I wanted to talk to everybody a little bit about the timeline of my work. If you have seen the work in the space, there's kind of 4 different trains of thought going on. And it can seem all disconnected, but I promise there is a method to my madness. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that at the core of my work is a need for a safe space to use my voice. Throughout college, I studied women and gender studies, and through those courses, I learned a lot about the censure of women's voices and marginalized people's voices systematically and personally. That's a really big, deep, heavy subject. We don't have the time or the capacity to go into it right now, but if you ever wanted to have a conversation with me or literally any of the staff at the Art Institute, I guarantee we will all talk to you about it. But the thing that you need to know about my work is that as a woman, I have had experiences and that my voice has not been valued or taken for face value, has been demeaned, has been kind of silenced. And this has happened kind of, like I said, systematically and personally. So it started in my work systematically, and I will kind of talk to you about that. But first, I did want to talk to you about 3 or 4 common things that you'll see in all of it, and I'll be showing pictures too. So the first thing that you'll see throughout is layering. This started back while I was a student at St. Scholastica. I would layer paints, colored pencils, markers, multimedia kind of materials to conceptually and literally push and pull things into frame. And that was me trying to safely use my voice and express what I needed to express while also covering up the things that I wanted to keep concealed. And I do this both for my own safety, but also for the safety of my relationships. A lot of what I'm, grappling with, wrestling with is personal, interpersonal relationships. Things that people have said to me, different things like that. And so through layering and also through abstraction, which is the next theme, I can be safe while also expressing myself. And so, yeah, I have notes. Sorry. And then the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on is the common use of the color black, or the non-color for the people who have studied color theory. I use black for a number of reasons. One of those is that duality. As a symbol, it represents horror, darkness, destruction, violence, and grief. But on the flip side, it can also be very elegant, tied to sexuality and sophistication. Talking in terms of color theory, black is both the absence and the presence of, depending on which color systems you're talking about. So, yeah, if you have, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'm a terrible color theorist, but for additive and subtractive, depending on how much light you have, that's how much black you have, essentially. My Sarah Brock Erickson is going to hate the way that I described that. And then finally, black is heavy. Oh, actually, not finally. Black is heavy and kind of implies gravity. So that's another reason that I use it, because the topics that I'm talking about are really heavy for me. And then finally, black and the monochrome specifically kind of removes the interpretation of color. So I'm kind of contradicting myself, because I said that it symbolically represents these things, but also the monochrome kind of removes that part for the viewer. You don't have to assume what I mean when I use blue or green. You can really just focus on my materials, which are really what's important to me: the texture, the lines, and the forms. So without further ado, let's talk about the 4 different things that you'll see. So the first one is the neuroses. So there's, I don't actually know how many there are on the wall. I think about 4 or 5 or 6 of these black on black works that you'll see in the corridor gallery. And these were some of the first works that I made during grad school. In 2017, prior to coming to grad school, I started experiencing some pretty serious pain in my abdomen and my reproductive system. I had always had really painful menstrual cramps and symptoms of that way, but in 2017, on the bus to the Women's March on Washington, something happened to me. I don't know, but all of a sudden I was in excruciating pain. And for about 6 months after that, it just kept on happening and coming in waves, and it was really unprovoked, and I was in and out of the hospital, being under every test you could possibly imagine, probably, and on paper, I was normal. And that is pretty common for things that women experience in the medical field, and that goes back to the voice. That's where my voice is being represented in. It was actually the work prior to this. I was making symptoms, because I felt as though there are studies and articles and books written about this topic, about how women are often considered unable to accurately present their or reflect upon their own experiences and their own pain. And I felt like that was happening to me because I was in this excruciating pain, but on paper I was normal. And so there was a body of work before these black works that I was making the symptoms. They were little soft sculptures, and they were verbs about what I felt like was happening in my body. But over time, those symptoms started to ease up, and instead they got replaced with the anxiousness that they'd come back, and the anxiousness and the stress of grad school. And so these works kind of build upon that with, instead of my symptoms of what's physically happening in my body, these are like the symptoms of the anxiety and stress spirals that was happening in my body. And that in itself, mental health has its own, weight of people not taking at face value you describing your experience. And so these works, if you see them in person, they are me. I stretched fabric over painting stretcher bars because I was a painter originally, and this is the materials that I had. I stretched the fabric over them, and then with a heat gun, I melted through them and kind of made this scar, this damage. And then methodically, I was mending them. And I would just sit and I would mend, and it would help me with my anxiousness because I was kind of sitting still. My hands were busy. My mind was busy. It was more so zoned out than anything. And this both helped me cope with the anxiety and depression that I was feeling. But it also, gave me a way to represent that in a safe way. And so, yeah, those are the neuroses. The second group of work that you'll see it follows directly that, and they kind of just like went one into another. I'm going to try to make this, I'll just move over. So these, from the neuroses, these kind of just came about. And these came about as I was playing with the fabrics in my heat gun. That's how I make all this melty kind of texture. And I was noticing that, different fabrics melted at different rates. Some of them didn't melt at all. Some of them changed colors when they melted. And the stitching that I was doing could kind of act as a resist. And when you're a painter, a resist is, how, like, leaving an intentional space open. So you'll see that with watercolor paintings. They use wax to resist the watercolor paint. And the thread could actually act in that same way because it was cotton. And the fabrics that I was using were polyester blends. When exposed to heat, those melt. Cotton, it doesn't really do anything like that. So that's how you can see this like line that goes through these. And so these, the ones on the wall in this little body of work, I think there's about 8 of them in total. They're not all on the wall, but the ones that I liked the best are there. And they are called the Legiums. And the Legium, and I'm not an expert at this, so if anybody is, please, please, please talk to me because I want to learn more. But Legium is a spiritual practice, and from what I understand of it, it is an ancient monastic practice in which people would read the Psalms, the biblical Psalms, and as they were reading it, they would capture the sparklets, the things that caught their eye. And I've kind of always done this while reading. I've kind of always like kept notes of things that stood out to me on the page. I also like to keep notes of things that people say, things from my podcasts, different things like that. I have just notebooks filled with them. Actually, most of my sketchbooks are just words. And so I was kind of pairing this idea of collecting. I was collecting fabrics, and I collect words, and I was kind of combining them. So yeah, these works, like I said, layering was a really big part of it. I would layer the fabrics in different ways to see how they would react to the heat, but then I was also hiding the text within them and kind of creating my own little Legium practices. I hope I described that well enough. It's really hard to describe because I don't know that much about it. It's one of those practices that's kind of hard for me to find things about. I learned about it in a podcast that I listened to where they compare 2 bits of text and find the meaning between them. So yeah, if anybody has questions, ask it in the chat because I can probably respond to questions a little bit better. But you can see the text in this piece. That's an example of where I'm hiding it into the work. And that carries through the rest of my work, except for I'm not hiding text in the work. I am titling my pieces with my Florilegia. So all of the titles for the next body of work and the following body are based off of that Florilegia. They're snippets of text that I have captured and written down in a book, and then they relate somehow to my experience or to what I'm trying to convey with the work. And so this was just like me kind of learning how that practice fit into my art world. But I don't embed text anymore. Maybe someday. But yeah, that's number 2. And then I will talk about the next one, which is, the next body of work are the Apparitions. I'm trying to pick them. There they are. So these are the Apparitions. So this is, I think there's 6 on display. I should have had these numbers ready. This is my thesis work from graduate school. And these are my Apparitions. They're all, except for the 3 newest ones, they're all about 8 feet tall, 13 inches wide, and they're made with a variety of fiber practices. And they are meant to be figures of experience. So figure as in like, not necessarily the human form, but kind of representing that, which is also why they're called apparitions. They're supposed to be kind of like ghostly, kind of like memories. And so they don't necessarily allude to a specific thing that happened to me, but more so a feeling or an emotion. But it's not like happy or sad. It's like a general state of being. And so I'm hoping that with the gesture of the line that I used by stitching them, you can kind of feel that I don't know, narrative that's being embedded into it, which I'll talk about in a little bit more with Amy, I think. So these works were, I will show you the installation shot. So this is my thesis. I'm going to move over so that you can see me. And so this was presented at Bowling Green State for my thesis exhibition. And so all of these works were meant to be together and apart. So I presented them as an installation, and they were meant to be seen this way, but they could also be seen as individual pieces, which is what they are right now at the Art Institute. But originally I wanted them to be seen in this very uniform kind of column fashion. And to me, they were kind of like chapters in a book of essays where they could stand alone on themselves, and they each share a different story, but they could also be read together as like one part of a whole, or as part of a big whole. And so I crocheted, I knitted, I wove, I quilted. Some of the pieces are also porcelain. They're not on display in the Art Institute, but 2 of the pieces incorporated me dipping ceramic into porcelain slip and firing out the fibers that remained and kind of petrifying them. I was melting again. I just kind of did everything that I could in my wheelhouse. And all of the techniques that I was using, were inspired by my matrilineage, like Amy had said in the statement. And so growing up, I watched my great-grandma until she passed away crochet, and she taught me really young how to crochet, and I didn't really know much about it, and I didn't know how big of an influence it would have in my life. I was in 2nd grade when she passed, and she just taught me how to chain stitch. But I think in high school, I picked it back up again, and this time I was learning from my mom, who is her granddaughter, so it's following this line of my matrilineage, and I learned a little bit from my grandma, who used to crochet as well, and then in college, I met my great aunt Carol for the first time, and we also talked about crocheting. So this is like a family legacy, that and making quilts, and different kind of needlework projects. So I've always been enamored by it, and I've always related it to my relationship with the women in my family. And with this body of work, I was really kind of diving into the different ways that they could have shared their story, and not necessarily a story that is known. I was thinking about kind of the performance of the repetition of stitch, and how you have to be so intentional with each stitch that you're making and pour so much of yourself into it. We kind of heard from Blair Truer's last artists talk about pouring yourself into these works, and she was so right. Like, each stitch, like, eventually they get painful. And I think that that process is so important to me, that repetition and that performance of just continuing to sit where the women in my family sat. That was the most important thing to this work. And using materials that they would have used, and maybe not in a way that they would have ever dreamed of using, because I'm using abstract shapes and kind of working with space, but not really. I'm making black work when they made flowers, but I was thinking about the ways that, you know, if they had a bad day, or if somebody had wronged them, or, you know, any sort of matter of a thing, if they were celebrating their child's birthday, them sitting in their chairs and, like, thinking about those things while also repetitiously making their stitches. And I was thinking about how that intent kind of gets embedded into your work. That's kind of like the most layman way that I can say it, is that my mental intent gets kind of embedded into the work. And yeah, so those are the apparitions. I hope all of that made sense, but if not, like I said, we're going to have a conversation. And then the last body that you will see on display is my most recent, and they're the embroideries. So after graduation, I was kind of lost, as I think most people end up. I was tired. I didn't have that amazing studio space anymore. And I also just didn't really want to think anymore, because I think a few of my grad school friends are watching right now. You think a lot, and you talk about your work a lot, and you have to, like, conceptualize everything. And I think that I just wanted a way to let go and to not think anymore. And so I started making these embroideries actually almost a year after I graduated. These started about the time that the stay-at-home order was called, this past March. And I'm still trying to figure them out. I'm really grateful that Amy let me put them on display and actually suggested that I could put them on display, because I didn't actually know if they were of any value or of anything that I should show people. They were really just me sitting down and making work because my hands needed to move. They were a coping skill for when the governor enacted that order, and I think that he should have. That is not a critique. But they were a coping skill for that. They were a coping skill for having lost my job, for spiraling through more anxiety and depression for both of those reasons. And to me, they're like little abstract vignettes of this whole experience of 2020 so far, but also, I think, my life, maybe. Like I said, I'm still trying to figure them out. But they just feel like the most honest thing that I've ever done. And for that reason, I'm scared for them to be on display, but here they are. And I just keep making them. I'm working on one right now. So yeah, that is my work in a nutshell. And I hope some of that made sense, but if not, I'm going to welcome Amy back, and we're going to make more sense of it. So, one sec, Amy. Okay, you're back, so unmute yourself, though.
Great.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Alyssa, for walking us through your exhibition.
Yeah.
I know there was a question from Sarah Brockie in terms of the scale of your work. So if you could, we know that the long apparitions, those are larger than a typical human body. What about your other pieces that are framed?
Sure.
On canvas?
Yeah.
They're not on canvas, but the canvas frame.
Yeah.
And then also maybe you could talk about the size of your embroideries.
For sure. So the Neuroses and the Legium, those are roughly the size of a piece of paper. Some of them are a little bit bigger, some of them are a little bit smaller, but they're all around that 8 to 10 or 8 by 10 inch range. And I don't know if she wanted to know about, like, the reason why, but typically when I make smaller work, it's so that I can do it faster. With those ones, that was definitely the case, was for the speed and also the accessibility of just like making a lot. In grad school, they want you to make a lot. So stitching on those larger canvases would have been a lot harder. But it also helped me work through ideas a lot faster. And then the large pieces, like I said, they're all 8 feet tall. And this what I'm about to say also worked in, or was how it was in undergrad too. When I work large like that is because I want my whole body to be involved, and I kind of want it to be exhausted. And that was definitely the case for my thesis work. Like I said, at some points it gets painful sitting there for that long, crocheting or stitching or what have you. At one point, the knit work that's on display it was actually knit twice. So I knit a tube that was probably could have wrapped around our school a few times. And then I knit that. And so that took a really long time. I took it to all the bars with me when we were out in grad school and looked like silly. I took it to classes. So when I work large, it's because I want my body to be activated and I want it to be exhausting. And it's that gesture of kind of pushing the limits. And then the embroideries, most of them are 4 inches, which is the smallest I've ever made anything in my whole life. And I think that's why they feel really scary to me, because they're like kind of the unknown. But again, like the piece of paper size ones, they help me work through it pretty quickly. I can sit down and make one of those each week, and it also kind of takes the judgment away from me because there's not a lot of space to work with. I just kind of have to go for it. I don't have to think about composition so much. It's just sit down and make shapes. So hopefully that was a good answer. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think what I found interesting to hear you say about those 4-inch embroidery pieces is that you feel like in some ways they're the most honest work you've ever made. And at the same time, at the very least in this exhibition, they're one of the only series that have color in them. And so these are pieces that are very current. You're continuing to do them even now. Are you continuing that use of color, and what's inspiring that change?
Yeah, so the color is kind of like edging its way back in. I was telling Amy this beforehand. In graduate school, we had a visiting artist come and talk to me, and literally the first thing she said to me was that I didn't know how to use color. And as a sad grad student, I let that kind of dictate what I did. I took the color out completely. Everything was white on white at first, and then white felt too pure and happy for the subject matter. So then I started digging into black and the symbolism of black mixed with the weight, like I had talked about. And that's kind of where I sat, and it was really comfortable. But lately I have been adding color back in. We've been getting some blue tones. And I feel like blue and black go like very safely together. They're not, it hasn't been a big stretch because blue can very quickly turn to indigo, which can very quickly turn to black. So it really is still a safety net for me. But I think that it can tie into the narrative a little bit more. A lot of my titles reference water, and a lot of the imagery also references water. And I think that that's really why it's also naturally easy to add blue in.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually I'll add more, maybe. I don't know.
What's that?
Eventually I might add in more colors, but I think Louise Nevelson's idea of the monochrome as removing like an unintended assumption to things, even though I am using blue for water. I think I really like that idea of the monochrome, and I kind of probably will always stay there. Maybe not always, but at least for the near future.
Right. And I would agree in terms of looking at your work in this show is very reminiscent of water. If, water were, a very deep, stormy black, or in some of your examples blue. And, a lot of that reference does have to do with the shapes that you're creating. Use a lot of circles in your work, whether you're sewing or you're embroidering or even when you're drawing. And I think the circle is such a universal shape, and it can mean so many different things to so many different people. What does it mean in your work?
For sure. So this is going to be one of those moments where there's a few things that I do keep secret. I keep kind of close, and that's why I work with abstraction, right? So, but I can say that water to me, I'm interested, like you said, the stormy water. I'm interested in its power and its both life-giving and destructive capabilities. When I'm having, spiraling bouts of anxiety and depression, I very much do feel like I drown in my thoughts. And I think that the gestural line in my drawings, that's kind of where that comes from, as well as the repetition of the circle, is that, there's so many of them on the composition that I'm hoping that can kind of be communicated. And if not, that's okay with me. I'm definitely of the mindset that once it's done, it is released into the world and people can do with it what they wish. We've talked a number of times that the process is what's really important to me. And so in the end, if people don't see a dark and stormy narrative, that is okay with me.
Well, I think you give some clues to your work. Certainly you have pieces that are untitled, but some of your other works are very richly titled. And the one that just came to mind when you mentioned drowning is one of your apparition pieces that's titled Stretch or Drown.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do make a nod towards a lot of watery literature.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk about where your collection of word choices come from.
Sure.
And in fact, I think we also have another question in the chat from Emma. Would you be willing to share some of your favorite word collections or the latest podcasts that you've been getting inspiration from?
Sure. So I am a reader. This bookshelf used to be full of books, but I am packing some things lately. And so I read everything. Dystopian novels, feminist literature, different kind of like biographies. I kind of have like a rotating list of things that I read. Poetry is in there too. And so to say, it's all kind of curated, right? So I am reading what I'm interested in and picking out the things that stand out to me as it's related to my own story. And so in that way, I think that my collections of text are a little bit biased, but that's okay. It's my work and it's what stands out to me as important. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where I've selected a lot of the text from, is poetry, feminist literature, dystopian novels, young adult literature. I love. I'm these days not the biggest fan of Harry Potter, but also the biggest fan of Harry Potter. I'm reading the newest Hunger Games book. It's kind of just everywhere, and it's literally just fragments of of sentences that just stand out to me as poetic or as something that could be related to my work. And I've just got pages of it in a notebook. And then I actually had a friend ask me this at one point, and it kind of relates. Which comes first, the title or the subject or the imagery? And it kind of goes back and forth. So I make this list kind of ongoing in my notebooks, and I'm making work ongoing. But I don't title until the work is done. And it kind of feeds itself, if that makes sense. I'm asked about podcasts that I'm listening to. So many. I really lately love, because of all of the kind of turmoil in the world, I love to listen to podcasts about mythology and folklore. I can name drop a few, but I just really love spirits podcasts and lore, and my friend just told me about scary stories. So these are kind of like folklore-ish, but it's kind of a response to where we are in the world. Normally I would listen to a lot of nonfiction podcasts and learn about business or art, but right now I can't. I gotta zone out a little bit. So hopefully does that answer that?
It does. I think I had this vision of what I want your collection of words to look like maybe in a little old cigar box on just like single slips of paper. And
Oh, sorry. In grad school it was just like Post-it notes everywhere. But recently I bought myself a notebook that has water on the front cover. And I transcribed all of this like collection of Post-it notes into a book. So it's actually like an organized chaos. But it was because I was losing things, so I would like have it in my mind, like I wrote this down somewhere and I couldn't find it.
Do you find that like the act of writing, does that help satisfy some of that need of your body to perform a repetition?
Yeah, so I will obsessively write things. I'm not a journaler, but when I'm having kind of like spiraling thoughts, I will just write that over and over again. My undergraduate work at St. Scholastica was me writing on the canvas and then covering it with paint. So text has always been really important to me. And I think that you see that a lot with artists and fiber artists. I think of Anne Hamilton, who I learned about also in undergrad, who relates text and fiber, as in like the text on a page is similar to a stitch in a book, or a stitch in a work of art, sorry, or a whatever you're making. So they kind of work together in the same way. I think that the reason that I went away from putting physical text into my work for a while is it was getting too obvious. Where I was just kind of like hitting somebody over the head with what I wanted to share. And like I said, for abstraction and the layering, I don't want that. I want there to be an ambiguity. I want it to be a safe space for me. And for, the interpersonal relationships that I'm wrestling with. So I don't really want to broadcast that for everybody.
Well, and I think that leads into another question asked by Sophie. You mentioned the aspect of your tradition in your stitchings. How have the women in your family reacted to your work?
That's a good question. I don't know if my mom's watching, but at one point my mom called me and asked me if I was okay, because it's all dark and dreary, and I talked about nightmares in my graduate thesis and urges, and at one point I was really interested in how my work as a feminist artist could address, it was like during the Me Too movement, how I could talk about that, because voice is so related to my work. And so I think at one point I probably caused some concern. But no, they haven't really talked to me about it that much. I hope that they feel honored. The only people from that line that I have with me still are my grandma and my mom. My great aunt and my great grandma passed away. But I hope that by, kind of adopting this as my voice and really trying to elevate it, I guess, away from, not to say that, Afghans and embroideries and different things like that aren't fine art, but hopefully by elevating it through what I'm doing, I hope that they feel honored. I don't know. I think they feel concerned lately, though. But it is what it is. We need to talk about mental health, and I need an outlet. So if stabbing something 3,000 times is what that outlet is, I can do it.
Well, and I think that really does speak towards like the women's place in historical society, where women were the ones that were holding the family together with stitches, like
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
sewing the family clothing.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that can imagine being that person who's completely overworked. You're extremely tired. You know, you're getting up at 2 a.m. to wash laundry with a washboard, and then you're tasked with clothing everyone in your family from their long underwear to their socks to their overcoats.
Yeah.
You know, it's certainly a tradition that we don't have anymore, but like I imagine that it in some way it still has to be in our memory.
Yeah.
Like, when you're working on your stitches, what does that repetition mean to you in terms of that?
Yeah. Well, I think the best thing for me to describe it as is a language. I feel like I can communicate with my ancestors. Like, we're not saying words, but we are sharing that experience. I'm sitting where May sat, who's my great grandma. You know, I've recreated some of her patterns, and it's like the most special experience to be able to recreate those patterns, because I'm literally doing the same thing that she did in the same posture. It's that gesture is what's so important to me. For women who I didn't really know, I have a way to connect with them, and my family doesn't really have many traditions. I think that that's pretty common these days, that we don't have a lot of traditions unless you're part of like a cultural, you know, group or belief system. And I think that crocheting and embroidery is that tradition to me. It's that way to connect with people who I will never know. I just moved to this town that I live in, Mora, last year, and my grandma, I guess, grew up here. I didn't know this until like a few months of living here, but I found like a whole lineage of history in this tiny town, this tiny Swedish town, or I think it's Swedish, yeah. But I just picture, like, were all these people in the cemetery crocheting and embroidering too? Like, I don't know. It's just something that I think about as a way to, like, connect and communicate. I don't know. I think of it as words, and as a language. And I honestly think that modern day people think of it as a language too. Even, I love Mr. Meow Meow McSparrow back there.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yes, everyone. Meow Meow McSparrow.
I think that people think of it as a language too, even if they don't say that outright, because you identify with people who knit. Like, if you see somebody knitting on the bus with you, you instantly have something in common with them because you do the same thing that they, like, the same stitches. You know how to do what they're doing. And so, yeah, I think that, I don't remember where I was going with this, but I think it's a language to me. And that performative gesture is part of it.
Well, and I think you touch on a subject very similar to what Blair Troyer had talked about in her entire exhibition, is about, in a way, being a white person losing that sense of traditional, traditions in general. Like, we've really lost touch with who we are, being handed down. We don't have very many ceremonies or actions that bring us together, that hold us together with our ancestry. And we do have one more question asking about your 3D work from your undergraduate capstone display. And earlier you had mentioned some sculptural work, and yet you're very insistent that you're not a sculptor. You definitely are creating two-dimensional objects.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see yourself ever, not ever, but are you close to potentially considering doing some sculpture work?
I wish. I don't know if it will ever leave. So in art terms, for something to, like, hang on the wall but also have dimension, I think it's called a relief. I don't know if I'll ever be able to leave the relief sector. I need that, like, safety of the wall. I don't understand space very well. I am a drawer and a painter, and I work with line. I like line, and that's why I like to embroider and to knit. I'm trying to think of what they were referencing from my undergraduate work, and I'm wondering if it is that veil that was in the space, because even that was two-dimensional, but it came into the space. And in that regard, yes, I will 100% continue going into the space because I like to activate the viewer's body in the way that when I'm working, my body is also being kind of an important part. But in terms of like ever making sculpture, probably not. I like the realm of 2.5 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
I like it to be two-dimensional, either like hanging off of the wall or two-dimensional with texture that projects, kind of, if that makes sense.
Right.
I'm a 2.5 dimensional artist.
Well, and if people are available next Wednesday, we'll be meeting with Susanna Gaunt, and that is also a topic that
Yep.
I'm sure she will be discussing
Absolutely.
as well, because that is exactly what's happening with some of her pieces, is that they're literally have started on the wall and now they're coming off, and she struggles with, at least she thinks, and her perception is that she's struggling with how do you make something fully three-dimensional without that.
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. It's like the hardest thing, because you have to think about, like, I don't know how people do this, how they make something in the fully 3 dimensions, because you have to, like, you're sitting here and your thing is here and you have to somehow figure out what's going on the other side. And I don't know if I can ever wrap my brain around that. I do like to play with the 4th dimension. I had referenced, and if that is time, I had referenced that knit work where I was bringing my knitting everywhere, and that, I think, referenced what we in academia call the 4th dimension, and everywhere else too, I guess. But I taught a 4D class in college, and for me, time actually does play a really big part in my work. And so for that piece, every day I switched thread or yarn that I was working with. And so in it being a 2-dimensional work, it is also a descriptor of time, because it's almost like a performance art, I guess. I was studying performance art at the time, and I think that it would have fit into that realm. But yeah, it's almost like a journal of time. I don't know the right word for it. Does that make sense?
I think you're right in terms of it being a performance, because by bringing it with you everywhere, again, you're stitching your everyday moments into this piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then by changing the yarn each day, you're effectively creating a daily journal.
Yeah, and each one, they were all different lengths. Like, some of them were this big and some of them were this big, the segments of color, well, black, different blacks. So it really was, I think, a documentation of time. Probably not what I should have been doing in my final semester of grad school, but it's one of my favorite pieces, so it paid off.
Right. Well, we do have one more question.
For sure. Thank you, everybody, for asking questions and engaging.
Yeah.
I'm hearing all of the dots, but like, I don't want to read them because it will distract me.
Well, here we have a question. Can you talk about your study of subjugation and the impact of that on fiber art?
Oh boy, that is a heavy topic. I think from my perspective as a woman, that's really all that I can speak to, right? In terms of subjugation, because I wouldn't ever want to speak for somebody else, and that's why. And every time I write about my work or talk about my work, it is from the lens of a woman. And I think that if you're interested in digging into this, it's actually a perfect time for me to drop that we're starting a book club at the Art Institute, reading The Subversive Stitch. And that's really where I learned a lot about the subjugation of women through craft, or women's craft, sorry, not through craft, and about how, women's work was seen as less and is seen as less. It has not been documented through history very well. And I think it goes back to, Amy, like you said, that utilitarian aspect to it. People didn't see it as art. And nowadays we are seeing it as art. Nowadays we are recognizing women as artists. But there is this whole, we could go on for hours of this whole art historical canon that totally negates this needlework, or this fiber work, these tapestries. And yeah, it's a really big can of worms to open.
Yeah.
And I gotta look at the question again to make sure that I answer it.
Okay. And while you're looking at that, I would throw in there too that I think throughout history, because women have been primarily in charge of making the utilitarian objects, whether it be blankets or clothing, people also had to then use those objects to the utmost of their need.
Mm-hmm.
And so once a blanket was no longer held together strongly enough, then it would be turned into something else. It would be turned into, rags, or
for sure,
a rag rug.
For sure.
So I think it absolutely, women have been subjugated.
Yeah.
Through the process of art, but it's also so utilitarian that the things that women were creating were actually so important that they had to be reused multiple times.
For sure. And I think that anything related to the domestic sphere really just gets passed off as not art, and as women's work. And that might not be as much these days, but in the historical study that I was doing, and I really recommend anybody who's interested in this topic, join our book club, because we will be talking about it. Otherwise, just read the book. It is fascinating. I did pull a quote from it, because I thought it was really important. If I can find it in my notes. Maybe not. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know if I can find it. That's okay. But I think of like the women, in terms of subjugation, I think of the women who weren't allowed to study art, and so this is what they did. They weren't allowed into the academies, so they did what they could in the domestic sphere. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to say on that other than, yeah, I think that it's something that I could go on, talk about for hours without, but I kind of would need a little bit of time first, if that makes sense. You caught me. Yeah. You caught me, Christina. You gave me a hard question. Sorry, everybody.
Well, yeah, and I think it's great to just reflect on what you have accomplished, and I think so often artists are pushed to talk about what's next. But one thing that I find really exciting about your work is that some of the pieces, those embroidery pieces, really are real time, and
for sure.
You're working on those right now. Where can people find your work and follow you?
Well, it's listed here on the screen. So my Instagram handle is a.jstudio or _studio. My name is Alyssa Swanson, so I don't get to have my name on the screen because or on my handle, because it's a very common one. So they can follow me there. My website is alyssaswansoncreative.com. But yeah, I think it is really exciting that all of this work, or at least that work, the embroideries, are what's next. And it puts me in a really interesting place, because that is a conversation that we would usually have had, is like, what do you see in the future? Like, you can see it. It's on the walls. And it's terrifying that they're on the walls. But because I don't have all the answers figured out. But they are very they're very honest, and I'm really drawn to that honesty. I mean, one thing that I would like to start doing is incorporating mixed media back in. I would love to start doing the embroidery with the paint. And so we'll see where that goes. If that goes, I don't really know.
Well, I'm excited to watch where you go, and I'm excited that you're so close, so it's going to be easy to follow your journey.
Yeah. Thanks for having me and for selecting me for this exhibition. It's been an honor, and it's something that I never really thought would happen. So I'm humbled and feel pretty good about it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Have you. And anyone who's interested in applying for a future exhibition at the Duluth Art Institute, just, please join our e-blasts, become a member, and you'll stay up to date on when our next open calls will be coming.
For sure, and do it. Like, that's the best thing that I can say to people, especially, like, I'm a very emerging artist. I graduated in 2019. Just apply, because you never know where you're going to be, right? I applied to this before I had even graduated, thinking, no way in heck would I get in, but at least they would know my name, and they would know that I want to continue building this relationship with them, the DAI. And I do that for most shows. Like, I just applied to everything, that, even if it does seem like a stretch. And I just encourage anybody who's fresh out of school or approaching that just dream, just, like, as corny as that sound, like, apply to things that you don't think you'll get into, because this is where I am. Like, I never thought that at fresh out of school I would have been called by the Duluth Art Institute to exhibit. So thanks, Amy. And the panel. It wasn't just you.
Absolutely.
But,
the 2020 panel
so
made some really, really tough and inspiring decisions. So
yeah.
All right.
One last thing.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. One last thing is CSS Art Rocks. I'm going to talk over you. Sorry. CSS Art Rocks. I would also not be here without St. Scholastica. That's one last shout out.
Well, we're lucky to have CSS in this community. That's for sure. They've been an amazing source of inspiration in terms of students coming into our fold through volunteerism. This year is certainly much more challenging, and we haven't been able to foster that relationship. So I'll be really excited to get back to that after the pandemic is over.
For sure. Well, thanks, everybody. And we are going to go.
Good night.
Good night.